Hello, this is Dice Group 19. My name is Jared,
My name is Kyle Fang.
My name's Kyle Chen.
and our game was the left, center, and right game. So for the rules, on the top left, there's a button called Rules that opens the app. And if you have the rules of the game are pretty simple. If you have three or more chips, then you roll three dice. If you have two chips, you roll two dice, and you have one chip, you roll one dice. Each player in the game starts off with three chips, and if you roll a one, two, or a three, you roll a dot, which means you do nothing. If you roll a four, that means left, so you pass it left. So in the perspective of player one, the person to player one's left would be player three, and the person to player one's right would be player two. Rolling a five means a C, which is a center pot. So you put the chip that corresponds to that dice roll into the center pot. And if you roll a six, you roll a right, which means you pass that chip right to player two. So in our code, we start with the dice animation function. And this dice animation function reads the images dice 1 to dice 6. And it uses a switch case not only to play the sound, but to show each image. So Kyle Fang will talk about the audio, the sound playing, and then I will talk about how the images will go.
Okay, so basically the sound is you load the MP3 file for the dice roll, and then you can use audio read to make it so that it reads it, and then it'll play it with the play parentheses player, and then afterwards it'll just play the sound after each button is clicked, and then we'll go back to Jared for the image.
So for each image, it's basically the same exact code, just copy paste it over and over. But we pause for 0.1 seconds so we can register it, and so it looks like it's actually rolling. And the switch case uses three cases, 1, 2, and 3. So case 1 will plot it onto the first axis, UI axis. Case 2 will plot it onto UI axis number 2, and case 3 for UI axis number 3. So as you can see, there's three axes over here, and this is UI axis, this is UI axis 2, and this is UI axis 3. Moving on to the startup function. So here is where we set the chips for each player to 3, and then we set the edit field value, which is these parts, into 3 as well. We also set the player 2 roll button and the player 3 roll button to invisible so that it can't be clicked and it forces player 1 to roll. And yeah, we will talk about the things speak later. So moving on to the roll button. So we reread the images and then we clear the axes. So clearing the axes will make sure that they don't overlap and they don't show up until the next player's turn. And then this checks how many rolls you have to do. So just like the rules, if the player has more than 3 chips, then we set the roll to 3. Otherwise, the number of chips is equivalent to the number of rolls. So if the player chips are less than 0 for some reason, then we set them to 0 and you will not roll. So the function we used, or not function, the code we used was Randy of 1 to 6 with a minimum value of 1 to a maximum value of 3. So this creates an array of basically 1 to 3 dimensions, and this is what we use for the length. If we use the length, we can tell how many rolls we have to do. So in this case, we have length is greater than 1, which will roll the first dice. So after that, it'll roll animate, which is the function that I talked about previously, where it'll do the animation and it'll play the sound. And then it will run into the function of the dice rolls. And Kyle Fang will talk about that once again.
So for the image show function, we're showing the image corresponding to what IMG1 is equal to, and that'll be dice 1. And it'll be displayed on UI axis, which is on the first axis. And the whole just holds the image so that it won't be deleted after the second image is showed. And the image size is used to size the dice image and then use it to perfectly fit in the axis. And that's basically all for the image function. And I'll go back to Jared for explaining the dice set.
So for dice set, this just follows the left, center, right thing, where, for example, if you roll a 4, a 4 would be equivalent to L. So that means you pass it left. So player 3 chips would increase by 1. If it's sent to the center, then center chips would increase by 1. And if it's sent to the right, then player 2 chips will increase by 1. So these are basically the same code, but for this one, we have length. So if length increases by 2, then, or if the length is equal to 2 or more, then we roll the second dice, and so on and so forth. So here we notice that roll animate is the input is 2 because we have to input it onto the second axis. And yeah, if you notice, all of these are UI axis 2 because it graphs it onto the second one. And it's the same thing for the third one. So UI axis 3, app roll animate 3, etc., etc. So this is also the same thing once again. If the length is equivalent to 3, then it'll roll the third dice. So at the end, it'll set all of the edit values into the same number of chips as after all that code has occurred. So these will become different values. Moving on to Kyle Chen for the win condition.
Yeah, so pretty much we first start off by reading over the images with game over and player 3 win. And it pretty much checks when player 1's score has been updated and sees if it is equal to 0. And then it would check another player, either player 2 or player 3, and if those are equal to 0, then it would show a game over for both of those players, and then a player would win. And that's pretty much the same for the other 3 dice rolls, or for the other 3 players.
So one last thing is that after you finish changing these, it changes the visibility of the button to be 0 or to be invisible, I guess. And then it moves on, it changes the turn number. So the turn number is used in end turn, which we will talk about later. So each of the roll buttons are basically the same. Where it clears the axes, it checks if it's how many dice you roll, etc., etc. And then these are the same. And yeah. So finally, we have these. Kyle Chen will talk about these again.
Yeah, so pretty much these are callbacks for the field values, and they pretty much do kind of the same thing, checking if player 1 or player 2 has 0 chips, and it shows game over for 2 of the players and a player win for the others. And that's the same for all 3 callbacks. And then now for table flip, for a callback for table flip, if the button is pressed, it pretty much just completely ends the game by showing game over for all 3 players and turns off the roll buttons for all 3 players so that they're not able to roll anymore. And finally, for the end turn button, we use a switch case to see which player should be able to roll, and that would change its visibility, the button visibility. And we also use ThinkSpeak here to relay the values of our roll to each player. Yeah, and now we could hand it off to Jared to play the game.
So before I finish, all we have here is ThinkSpeak Write, which will send over the data after all the buttons have been rolled, or after we have finished our turn, I guess, because that's what the enter button is for. And it'll write the data to ThinkSpeak, and then each turn, oh dear, each turn we will use ThinkSpeak Read to change the values of the chips. And obviously, if you think about it, that wouldn't work if we roll for player 1, which is why we start with in the startup, we have first run is equivalent to 0. So here, if I use the if statement, if app.first run is greater than 0, then it would read from ThinkSpeak. Because there isn't any input from ThinkSpeak to begin with, that's why we have to set this to 0, and it won't run for the first time we click player 1 roll. But afterwards, at the end of this, we set um, app.first one equal to 1, which will allow this if statement to continue for the rest of the game until someone loses. So for player 2 roll and player 3 roll, they will all automatically read the ThinkSpeak because it's assumed that you will be playing with other people. So moving on to the actual game, you have 3 buttons: player 1 roll, or at the start you have 3 buttons: player 1 roll, table flip, and end turn. So you've already seen what the rules do, but let's roll. So as you can see, the sounds play, and for the first roll, we roll a 2, a 4, and a 5. So a 4 moves on to the left, so player 3 gets 1, and a 5 is centered, so center chips gets 1 as well. And as there's no buttons left, we have to end the turn, so player 2 is able to go. And player 2 rolls. That's a 6, 6, and a 4. So player 7 gains 2 chips, and player 1 gains 1 chip. And we keep going until someone wins. And for the table flip function, this is used when someone is angry, I guess, and they don't want to play anymore. It plays game over for each player. And yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.